Marcus Thompson stepped out of the sleek black car that had dropped him off at the entrance of the Grand Regency Hotel. The building loomed tall and majestic, its glass facade shimmering under the golden rays of the setting sun. It was one of those places where luxury wasn't just promised, it was delivered in spades. From the chandeliers hanging above the grand lobby to the impeccably dressed staff moving about with practiced precision, everything screamed opulence. Marcus adjusted his tie as he walked toward the revolving doors. He had been traveling nonstop for days, attending meetings, signing deals, and making sure his company stayed ahead of the competition. Now, all he wanted was a quiet room where he could rest before tomorrow's big summit, a gathering of some of the brightest minds in tech. As the CEO of a rapidly growing startup, Marcus knew how important it was to network and build relationships. But tonight, he needed peace. The hotel lobby smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood, a calming aroma that almost made him forget the exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. Almost. He approached the front desk, his suitcase rolling, softly behind him. A young woman sat there, tapping away on her keyboard without looking up. Her name tag read, Lila, though Marcus doubted she'd remember hers once this interaction ended. "Good evening," Marcus said politely, offering a warm smile. His voice carried just the right amount of friendliness, neither too casual nor overly formal. Years of being in leadership roles had taught him the importance of first impressions. Lila glanced up briefly, her eyes flickering over him like a scanner assessing an object. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw something shift in her expression, an almost imperceptible wrinkle of confusion or maybe even disdain. But it disappeared so quickly that he wondered if he'd imagined it. She didn't return his smile. "Checking in?" she asked flatly, her tone devoid of any warmth. "Yes, I have a reservation under Marcus Thompson," he replied, still maintaining his composure. He slid his ID and credit card across the counter, watching as Lila picked them up with 2 fingers, as if they might contaminate her otherwise pristine workspace. Her eyebrows arched slightly when she saw the name on the card. Then came the pause, the kind of awkward silence that stretches longer than it should, filling the air with tension. Marcus felt it immediately. Something was off. "Is there a problem?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. His tone remained calm. But inside, a small alarm bell began to ring. This wasn't the usual smooth check-in process he was accustomed to, especially not at a 5-star establishment like the Grand Regency. Lila hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, she spoke. "Are you sure this is your card?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the hum of activity in the lobby. She didn't whisper either. Her voice carried, drawing the attention of a few nearby guests who turned their heads curiously. Marcus blinked, taken aback by the question. Of course it was his card. Why would anyone carry someone else's? But instead of snapping back, he chose diplomacy. After all, misunderstandings happened. People made mistakes. Maybe she was having a bad day. "It's definitely mine," he said firmly, leaning closer to the counter. "Would you mind checking again?" For a split second, Lila looked uncomfortable, as though she hadn't expected him to push back. But then her demeanor shifted. Instead of apologizing or double-checking the system, she crossed her arms and gave him a look that bordered on condescending. "Well, sir," she said, dragging out the word "sir" in a way that sounded more mocking than respectful. "This is a black Amex card. Not many people can afford these. Are you absolutely certain it belongs to you?" The room seemed to freeze. Marcus felt the weight of her words settle heavily around him, like a thick fog rolling in unexpectedly. He stared at her, trying to process what had just happened. Was she seriously questioning whether he owned the card because of its exclusivity? Or was there something deeper at play here? Around them, the lobby buzzed with murmurs. Some guests exchanged glances while others outright stared. A businessman standing nearby cleared his throat awkwardly, pretending to focus on his phone. An older couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads disapprovingly. Even the bellhop hovering nearby shifted uncomfortably, unsure of whether to intervene. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd faced situations like this before, moments when people underestimated him based on preconceived notions. It wasn't new territory for him, but it never failed to sting. Still, he reminded himself that reacting emotionally wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would only give Lila more ammunition to use against him. "I assure you," Marcus said slowly, enunciating each word with deliberate clarity. "This card is mine. My name is right there, plain as day. Perhaps we can move forward with the check-in process now." But Lila wasn't done yet. Instead of acknowledging his request, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms again. "Look, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "We've had issues with fraud recently. I'm just doing my job here. No need to get defensive." Marcus clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to argue further. Every fiber of his being wanted to call her out on her blatant disrespect. But he knew better. Arguing with someone who clearly had no intention of listening wouldn't help. Besides, he was tired, not just physically but emotionally, and this confrontation was draining what little energy he had left. Instead, he decided to escalate the situation. "I'd like to speak with your manager," he said, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside him. "Right now." Lila raised an eyebrow, seemingly unfazed by his demand. "The manager is busy," she replied dismissively. "But if you insist, I can page him, though I doubt he'll see things differently." Marcus nodded, refusing to let her bait him. "Page him," he said simply, folding his arms across his chest. "Let's see what he has to say." As Lila reluctantly reached for the phone, Marcus couldn't help but glance around the lobby again. The atmosphere had changed entirely. What had once been a serene, welcoming space now felt tense and charged with unease. People were still watching, their expressions ranging from sympathy to disbelief. Some even pulled out their phones, likely recording the scene unfolding before them, and somewhere deep down Marcus realized this moment was bigger than him. It wasn't just about a rude receptionist or a botched check-in. It was about the assumptions people made based on appearances, the judgments they passed without knowing a single thing about who you really were. He straightened his posture, reminding himself of who he was and where he stood. Marcus Thompson wasn't just another guest at the Grand Regency Hotel. He was a self-made success story, a man who had worked tirelessly to build a life most people could only dream of, and no amount of ignorance or prejudice could take that away from him. When the assistant manager finally arrived, a middle-aged man named Richard, Marcus braced himself for what was coming next. Whatever happened, he vowed to handle it with grace and dignity, because at the end of the day, actions spoke louder than words, and Marcus intended to make sure his actions sent a message loud and clear. The assistant manager, Richard, approached the front desk with a brisk walk that suggested he was used to handling crises, or at least pretending to. His suit was neatly pressed, his tie perfectly knotted, and his polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. At first glance, he seemed like the kind of person who could diffuse any situation with ease. But as Marcus watched him approach, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to end well. "Good evening, sir," Richard said, offering a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand there's been an issue here?" Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't want to appear too confrontational, but he also knew better than to let his guard down. "Yes, there has been," he replied evenly. "I'm trying to check in, but your receptionist seems to have some concerns about my credit card." Richard glanced at Lila, who was still standing behind the counter with her arms crossed. She gave him a subtle shrug as if to say, "It's not my fault." Then, without missing a beat, Richard turned back to Marcus. "Well, we do take security very seriously here at the Grand Regency," Richard began, his tone carefully measured. "We've had incidents of fraudulent activity in the past, so we need to be cautious." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his patience starting to wear thin. "Fraudulent activity?" he repeated, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "Are you suggesting that I'm attempting to commit fraud?" Richard hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. For a split second, his professional facade cracked, revealing a flicker of discomfort. But just as quickly he recovered, smoothing out his features into a mask of practiced indifference. No, not at all, Richard stammered, holding up his hands defensively. I'm simply saying that we have protocols in place to protect our guests and ourselves from potential risks. It's standard procedure. Standard procedure? Marcus echoed, his voice rising ever so slightly. He leaned forward slightly, resting his palms on the edge of the counter. So it's standard procedure to accuse a guest of using someone else's credit card because of… what, exactly? The color of their skin? The words hung heavy in the air, silencing everyone, within earshot. Even the soft hum of conversation in the lobby faded away, leaving only the sound of distant footsteps and the faint rustle of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. All eyes were now on Marcus and Richard, the tension between them palpable. Richard blinked rapidly, clearly unprepared for such a bold accusation. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, searching for the right words. Finally, he settled on a weak rebuttal. Sir, I assure you, this isn't about race. It's purely a matter of verification. We need to confirm your identity before proceeding. Marcus stared at him, his dark eyes boring into Richard's with an intensity that made the other man squirm. Then why did your receptionist feel the need to comment on the type of credit card I carry? He asked, his tone cutting through, the pretense like a knife. Why did she imply that someone like me wouldn't belong in a place like this? Richard swallowed hard, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Out of the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed Lila shrinking back slightly, her earlier bravado replaced by a nervous fidgeting. She knew she'd gone too far, and now she was, paying the price for it. I apologize if anything was said that made you feel uncomfortable, Richard said finally, though his apology lacked sincerity. But please understand, we're just doing our jobs. Marcus shook his head slowly, disappointment etched across his face. Doing your job doesn't mean treating people differently based on assumptions, he said firmly. And it certainly doesn't mean humiliating them in front of an entire lobby full of people. By now, the crowd around them had grown larger. Some guests had gathered closer, eager to witness the drama unfold, while others lingered nearby, pretending to browse through brochures or scroll through their phones. A few whispered audibly, their comments ranging from sympathetic, "Poor guy, he doesn't deserve this," to judgmental, "They're probably just following protocol." One elderly woman seated near the entrance stood up and approached the desk, her cane tapping gently against the floor. She wore a warm smile and carried herself with quiet dignity. "Excuse me," she said softly, addressing Richard. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there a reason why this gentleman is being treated this way? He seems perfectly respectable, to me." Richard looked flustered, caught between placating the woman and maintaining his authority. "Ma'am, I assure you we're handling the situation appropriately," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "There's no cause for concern," the woman frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Appropriately?" she echoed, her tone sharp enough to make Richard flinch. "From where I'm standing, it looks like you're harassing a paying customer. That doesn't seem appropriate to me." Her words drew murmurs of agreement from the onlookers. Encouraged by her courage, another guest, a middle-aged man in a business suit, spoke up. "Yeah, I've been waiting to check in for 10 minutes now, and this whole thing is ridiculous," he said, gesturing toward Marcus. "If he says the card is his, then it's his. Let him check in already." Richard glanced around nervously, realizing he was losing control of the situation. The last thing he needed was a public relations nightmare on his hands. Guests were already pulling out their phones, snapping photos and recording videos of the unfolding scene. Social media could amplify this incident in seconds, turning it into a viral sensation that would tarnish the hotel's reputation. Desperate to regain some semblance of order, Richard turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said quickly, his tone shifting to one of forced politeness. "If you'll allow us to verify your information one more time, we can get you checked in right away." Marcus studied him for a long moment, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to refuse, to demand an immediate resolution or even threaten legal action, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Besides, he was tired. Exhausted, really. All he wanted was to retreat to his room, put this ordeal behind him, and focus on the summit tomorrow. "Fine," Marcus said finally, his voice low but firm. "Let's get this over with." Relieved, Richard motioned for Lila to retrieve Marcus's documents and begin the verification process. As she typed furiously on her keyboard, Marcus stood silently, his arms crossed, watching her every move. The tension in the lobby remained thick, almost suffocating, but Marcus refused to show any sign of weakness. He kept his gaze steady, his posture confident and his demeanor calm. After several agonizing minutes, Lila finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Everything checks out," she muttered begrudgingly, sliding the keycard across the counter. "Your room is ready." Marcus picked up the card without a word, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Marcus saw something there. Regret, perhaps, or maybe even shame. But whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As he turned to leave, the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier stepped forward once more. "Young man," she said kindly, placing a gentle hand on his arm, "I hope you don't let this ruin your stay. You deserve better than this." Marcus offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means a lot." With that, he walked away, his suitcase rolling quietly behind him. The lobby gradually returned to its usual rhythm, the whispers fading into background noise. But Marcus knew the memory of this encounter would linger, not just for him but for everyone who had witnessed it. And as he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for his floor, he resolved to ensure that this wouldn't be the end of the story. As the elevator doors slid shut behind him, Marcus leaned against the polished metal wall, exhaling deeply. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. His mind raced with thoughts, anger, frustration, disbelief, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself, but the image of Lila's smug expression kept flashing in his mind. Her dismissive tone, her thinly veiled skepticism, it was all too familiar. He clenched his fists tightly, feeling the sharp edges of his nails digging into his palms. For years, he'd faced moments like this, instances where people judged him, not by his achievements or character, but by preconceived notions rooted in bias. It wasn't new territory for him, but it never failed to sting. What made this time different, though, was the public nature of the humiliation. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had witnessed it, the guests who had stared, whispered, and recorded the scene. The elevator dinged softly as it reached his floor, pulling Marcus back to the present. He stepped out into the hallway, the plush carpet muffling the sound of his footsteps. The corridor was quiet, almost eerily so, offering a stark contrast to the chaos he'd left behind downstairs. Room service carts sat abandoned near some doors, their contents neatly arranged while soft lighting bathed the walls in a warm glow. Everything looked pristine, luxurious, even inviting. But Marcus couldn't shake the bitterness lingering in his chest. He stopped in front of his room, sliding the keycard into the slot. The tiny green light blinked, signaling that the door was unlocked. Pushing it open, he stepped inside and immediately tossed his suitcase onto the luggage rack. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a five-star hotel. A king-sized bed adorned with crisp white linens, a sleek desk equipped with a charging station, and a panoramic window overlooking the city skyline. Normally, such opulence would have brought him a sense of calm. Tonight, however, it felt hollow. Marcus walked over to the minibar and grabbed a bottle of water, twisting off the cap and taking a long sip. The cool liquid did little to quench the fire burning inside him. He paced back and forth across the room, replaying the events in his head. Every word, every glance, every subtle insult, it played on a loop, refusing to let him rest. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath, stopping mid-stride to stare out the window. The city lights twinkled below, cars zipping along the streets like tiny streaks of light. To anyone else, it might have been a beautiful sight. To Marcus, it felt distant, detached, as if the world outside didn't care about what had happened. Inside those gilded walls, his phone buzzed suddenly, snapping him out of his thoughts. Pulling it out of his pocket, he saw a notification from Twitter. Someone had tagged him in a post. Is this really how Grand Regency treats its guests? Can customer service fail? Attached was a video clip, one of the many recordings taken during his confrontation at the front desk. Already the tweet had hundreds of likes and retweets, with comments pouring in from strangers expressing outrage on his behalf. Marcus scrolled through the replies, his jaw tightening with each passing second. Some users praised him for staying composed despite the blatant disrespect. Others called out the hotel for its apparent prejudice, vowing never to stay there again. A few even shared their own stories of being mistreated because of their race or appearance. Reading those messages hit Marcus harder than he expected. It wasn't just him. It was a pattern, a systemic issue that went far beyond one rude receptionist or an incompetent manager. For a moment, Marcus considered ignoring the whole thing. He could delete the app, turn off his phone, and pretend none of it had happened. After all, he'd gotten what he came for, a room, and tomorrow he'd be gone. But something deep within him resisted that idea. Ignoring the problem wouldn't make it go away. In fact, it would only allow it to fester, perpetuating the cycle of discrimination and injustice. Pacing again, Marcus ran through his options. He could file a formal complaint with the hotel management, demanding accountability. He could write a scathing review online, detailing every excruciating detail of his experience. Or, he paused, a thought forming in his mind. He could take matters into his own hands, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated the way he had tonight. Sitting down at the desk, Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up his contact list. Years of building connections in the business world had given him access to some of the most influential figures in various industries, including hospitality. Among them was James Carter, the CEO of Prestige Hospitality Group, the parent company that owned the Grand Regency Hotel. Marcus hesitated for a moment, staring at James's name on the screen. They weren't close friends, but they'd crossed paths at several industry events, exchanging pleasantries and discussing potential collaborations. Would James listen? More importantly, would he act? Taking a deep breath, Marcus picked up his phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before James answered, his voice warm and familiar. "Marcus, how's it going?" "Hey, James," Marcus replied, his tone measured but firm. "I need a few minutes of your time. Something came up." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Sure thing," James said, sounding slightly concerned. "What's going on?" Marcus launched into an explanation, recounting the evening's events in vivid detail. He described the receptionist's dismissive attitude, the assistant manager's lackluster apology, and the overall atmosphere of hostility he'd encountered. As he spoke, his voice grew steadier, more resolute. By the time he finished, there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. James listened intently, interjecting only once or twice to ask clarifying questions. When Marcus finally fell silent, there was a long pause. Then James sighed heavily. "Marcus, I'm sorry you had to go through that. That's unacceptable, and it has no place in any establishment under my company's umbrella." "I appreciate that," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "But apologies aren't enough. Actions speak louder than words. If nothing changes, then this will happen again, to someone else." "You're absolutely right," James agreed, his tone serious now. "And trust me, appropriate action will be taken. I'll personally oversee it." Marcus nodded, even though James couldn't see him. "Good, because this isn't just about me. It's about sending a message that discrimination won't be tolerated, not in your hotels and not anywhere else." "Understood," James said firmly. "Consider it handled." They ended the call shortly after, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts once more. Leaning back in the chair, he exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and determination wash over him. He knew calling James wouldn't magically erase the pain of the past hour, but it was a start. Accountability mattered, and holding people responsible for their actions was the first step toward real change. Feeling restless, Marcus stood up and wandered over to the window again. Below, the city continued to pulse with life, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded just moments earlier. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, and neon signs flickered brightly against the night sky. It was a reminder that the world kept moving regardless of individual struggles. But Marcus also knew that sometimes standing still was necessary. Sometimes pausing to reflect and to act could create ripples that extended far beyond what anyone anticipated. Tonight, he had chosen to stand up for himself, not just as a guest wronged by a hotel, but as a symbol of resilience in the face of prejudice. And tomorrow, when the sun rose, those ripples would begin to spread. As he climbed into bed, exhaustion finally catching up with him, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Justice might not always come swiftly, but it would come. And when it did, it would carry a message loud and clear. No one deserved to be treated as less than human, not in a luxury hotel, not in a boardroom, and certainly not in life. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the gaps in the heavy curtains, casting golden streaks across the plush carpet of Marcus's hotel room. Despite the luxurious surroundings, sleep had been elusive for him the previous night. Every time he closed his eyes, fragments of the confrontation at the front desk replayed in his mind. The dismissive glances, the condescending remarks, the palpable tension in the lobby. He had tossed and turned, wrestling with emotions that ranged from anger to frustration to a deep-seated sadness. Finally, around dawn, Marcus gave up on sleep altogether. He showered, dressed in a fresh suit, and headed down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. The dining area was bustling with activity, guests chatting animatedly over coffee, waitstaff weaving between tables with trays of food, and the soft clinking of silverware against fine china providing a soothing background melody. Yet, as Marcus entered, he couldn't help but feel like all eyes were on him. Was it paranoia? Or had word of last night's incident spread among the staff? He chose a quiet corner table near the window where he could observe without being directly in the spotlight. A waiter approached promptly, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. What can I get you started with today?" Marcus ordered. A simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice, and tried to focus on the view outside. The city was waking up, its streets filling with commuters and delivery trucks. It was a stark contrast to the stillness he felt inside. His mind kept circling back to the phone call he'd made to James Carter the night before. Had James followed through on his promise? Would there be consequences for Lila and Richard? And if so, what would those consequences look like? His thoughts were interrupted when another guest, a middle-aged man in a business suit, approached his table. The man carried himself with an air of confidence, his tie perfectly knotted and his leather briefcase polished to a shine. "Excuse me," he said, extending a hand. "Are you Marcus Thompson?" Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and shaking the man's hand. "Yes, that's me." "I thought so," the man replied, smiling warmly. "My name is David Levine. I'm here for the Tech Summit. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened last night at the front desk, and I want you to know, you handled it with incredible grace." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," he said cautiously. "That means a lot." David nodded earnestly. "It does. Because frankly, most people wouldn't have stayed as calm as you did. They humiliated you, plain and simple, and while I don't know the specifics of your situation, I do know one thing: you didn't deserve that." For a moment, Marcus struggled to find the right words. Here was a complete stranger validating his experience, acknowledging the injustice he'd faced. It wasn't something he encountered often, especially not from someone outside his immediate circle. "I appreciate that," he finally said, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. It's good to hear." David pulled out a chair without waiting for an invitation and sat down. "Look, I won't take up too much of your time," he continued. leaning forward slightly. "But I've been in this industry long enough to recognize systemic issues when I see them. What happened to you isn't isolated. It's part of a larger problem. And honestly, it's refreshing to see someone stand up and demand accountability." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You think it's refreshing?" "Absolutely," David said, his tone firm. "Too many people let these things slide because they don't want to make waves or risk damaging relationships. But change doesn't happen unless we speak up. Last night you spoke up. You called out their behavior, not just for yourself but for everyone who might walk into that lobby and face the same treatment." The waiter returned with Marcus's breakfast, setting the plate down gently. Both men paused as Marcus thanked him, then resumed their conversation once they were alone again. "Do you think anything will come of it?" Marcus asked after a moment, cutting into his eggs. "Or am I just shouting into the void?" David chuckled softly. "From what I've heard about James Carter, he doesn't strike me as the type to ignore something like this. If anyone can make sure heads roll, it's him. But beyond that—" He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Beyond that, you've already made an impact. People are talking about what happened. Social media is blowing up. Even some of the guests here this morning mentioned it during breakfast." Marcus frowned, surprised. "Really?" "Oh, absolutely," David confirmed. "One couple even said they're reconsidering staying at this hotel chain altogether. Word travels fast, especially in situations like this. You've sparked a conversation, whether you intended to or not." A strange mix of emotions washed over Marcus: pride, satisfaction, and a lingering sense of unease. On one hand, it felt empowering to know that his actions had resonated with others. On the other hand, the fact that such an incident had occurred in the first place was infuriating. Why should anyone have to fight for basic respect? Why should standing up for oneself be considered extraordinary? As if sensing his internal turmoil, David leaned back in his chair and added, "You know, sometimes it's easy to forget how much power we hold as consumers. Hotels, restaurants, airlines, they rely on us to keep their businesses running. When we speak up, they listen. Not always immediately, but eventually." Marcus nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. David was right. This wasn't just about holding individuals accountable. It was about sending a message to the entire system. Respect wasn't optional. It was non-negotiable. And if companies refused to uphold that standard, then they deserved every ounce of backlash they received. Their conversation ended shortly afterward, with David excusing himself to prepare for the day's meetings. As Marcus finished his breakfast, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever happened next, whether Lila and Richard faced consequences or not, he had done his part. He had stood up, spoken out, and refused to let the moment pass unnoticed. By late morning, signs of fallout began to emerge. Staff members moved through the lobby with nervous energy, exchanging hushed whispers and furtive glances. Guests who had witnessed the scene the night before now openly discussed it, their voices carrying hints of indignation and disbelief. One woman loudly canceled her reservation at the front desk, citing the hotel's unacceptable behavior as her reason. Another demanded to speak with a manager, vowing to share her negative experience online. Meanwhile, Marcus received a text from James Carter. "Updates coming soon. Stay tuned." It was brief, but the implication was clear. Action was being taken. Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he tucked his phone back into his pocket. Justice might not always be swift, but it was inevitable. Later that afternoon, Marcus attended the tech summit, delivering a keynote speech that earned thunderous applause. As he stood on stage, fielding questions from the audience, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Just hours earlier, he had been treated as though he didn't belong in a luxury hotel. Now he commanded the attention of hundreds of influential professionals, each hanging on to his every word. Afterward, several attendees approached him to express admiration for both his professional achievements and his courage in addressing the incident at the Grand Regency. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination, while others pledged support for his efforts to hold the hotel accountable. Each interaction reinforced what Marcus already knew. Standing up for yourself wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about creating a ripple effect that inspired others to do the same. By the end of the day, exhaustion settled over him like a heavy blanket. He returned to his room, collapsing onto the bed with a sigh. Tomorrow he would check out and leave the Grand Regency behind, but the memory of what had transpired would stay with him forever. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus reminded himself of one undeniable truth. Progress wasn't achieved by staying silent. Change required action, determination, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And though the road ahead might be long, Marcus knew he had taken the first step, one that would pave the way for others to follow. The following morning, Marcus woke up feeling a mix of emotions: relief, resolve, and a lingering sense of unease. The confrontation at the Grand Regency Hotel had been exhausting, but it also felt like a turning point. He wasn't just leaving behind a luxurious room. He was walking away from an experience that had tested his patience, resilience, and faith in humanity. Yet, as much as he wanted to put the incident behind him, he knew its impact would ripple far beyond his stay. After packing his suitcase and tidying up the room, Marcus made his way down to the lobby. The atmosphere was noticeably different today. Gone was the usual hum of cheerful chatter among guests and staff. Instead, there was an eerie quietness, a tension that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Employees moved about with visible apprehension, their smiles forced and their movements hurried. Guests whispered amongst themselves, their voices low but urgent, clearly discussing the fallout from the previous night's events. As Marcus approached the front desk to check out, he noticed that neither Lila nor Richard were present. In their place stood a new receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm demeanor. She greeted him politely, her tone sincere and respectful. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. Checking out?" "Yes," Marcus replied, handing over his keycard. "Thank you." She processed his request efficiently, avoiding any unnecessary comments or questions. It was a stark contrast to the treatment he'd received upon arrival. Still, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this sudden professionalism was genuine, or merely a reaction to the pressure mounting against the hotel. Before leaving, Marcus decided to take one last look around the lobby. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Things were unraveling quickly for the Grand Regency. Near the entrance, a group of guests clustered together, animatedly discussing something on their phones. One man held up his device, showing a screenshot of a viral tweet recounting Marcus's ordeal. Another guest shook her head disapprovingly, muttering, "I'll never stay here again." A few feet away, a couple argued with a concierge, demanding refunds for their reservations. "We read about what happened," the woman said sharply. "It's unacceptable. We don't want to support a business that treats people like that." The concierge nodded repeatedly, clearly overwhelmed. "I understand your concerns, ma'am. Please allow me to escalate this to our management team." Marcus watched silently, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because the hotel was finally facing consequences for its actions, or rather, inactions. Sadness because it shouldn't have taken such a public spectacle to spark change. Discrimination shouldn't require viral outrage to be addressed. It should be rooted out proactively, long before anyone gets hurt. Just as he turned to leave, a young bellhop approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson," he said softly, almost timidly. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus paused, studying the young man's face. He looked nervous, fidgeting with the hem of his uniform jacket. "Of course," Marcus replied, gesturing for him to continue. The bellhop glanced around briefly, ensuring no one else was listening, then leaned in closer. "I just wanted to say, thank you," he whispered, "for standing up to them. A lot of us who work here know how bad things can get sometimes, but we're scared to say anything. You showed us that it's possible to make a difference." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected gratitude from someone working within the very system he was challenging. But then again, perhaps it made perfect sense. Employees often bore the brunt of toxic environments, trapped between unfair policies and unsupportive leadership. Seeing someone push back against that toxicity could inspire hope, even courage. "Thank you for saying that," Marcus said sincerely. "Change isn't easy, but it starts when people refuse to stay silent. Keep believing in the possibility of better days ahead." The bellhop nodded earnestly, offering a small smile before hurrying off to assist another guest. Watching him go, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about punishing those responsible for his mistreatment. It was about creating a culture where accountability and respect became the norm, not the exception. Later that day, as Marcus boarded his flight home, his phone buzzed with a series of notifications. Opening it, he discovered that the story of his encounter at the Grand Regency had exploded online. News outlets picked up the viral tweets, framing it as yet another example of systemic bias in high-profile establishments. Comment sections filled with passionate debates, ranging from personal anecdotes of discrimination to calls for widespread reform in the hospitality industry. But what caught Marcus's attention most was a statement issued by Prestige Hospitality Group, the parent company of the Grand Regency Hotel. James Carter had wasted no time in addressing the situation publicly. The press release was concise yet impactful. "At Prestige Hospitality Group, we pride ourselves on delivering exceptional service and fostering inclusive environments for all our guests and employees. Recent events at the Grand Regency Hotel have fallen woefully short of these values. Effective immediately, disciplinary action has been taken against individuals involved in the unacceptable treatment of a valued guest. Additionally, we are implementing comprehensive training programs aimed at eliminating bias and ensuring equitable treatment moving forward. We deeply regret the harm caused and remain committed to rebuilding trust within our community." Reading the statement, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. While words alone wouldn't erase the pain of his experience, they signaled a step in the right direction. Accountability mattered, not just for those directly affected, but for everyone watching and hoping for change. When Marcus landed back in Silicon Valley, he found himself reflecting on the broader implications of what had transpired. His decision to call James Carter hadn't been driven by vengeance or ego. It had stemmed from a desire to hold the hotel accountable and prevent similar incidents from happening to others. And now, thanks to social media amplifying his story, countless people were joining the conversation about racial bias and customer service standards. Over the next few weeks, Marcus received numerous messages from strangers, some thanking him for speaking out, others sharing their own stories of discrimination. Many expressed admiration for his composure during such a difficult situation. One message, in particular, stood out to him. It came from a young Black entrepreneur who wrote, "Dear Mr. Thompson, I've followed your career for years, always inspired by your achievements. But hearing about how you handled yourself at the Grand Regency gave me strength. As someone trying to break into the tech world, I often face doubts, not just from others, but from myself. Your courage reminds me that success isn't just about reaching goals. It's about paving the way for others to follow. Thank you for being a role model." Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes as he read the note. He realized that his actions had resonated far beyond the confines of a single hotel lobby. They had touched lives, sparked conversations, and ignited a movement toward greater accountability and inclusivity. In the months that followed, Marcus continued to advocate for diversity and equity, not just in the hospitality industry but across all sectors. He partnered with organizations focused on combating racial bias, delivered speeches at conferences, and used his platform to amplify marginalized voices. Each step forward reinforced his belief that progress required collective effort. Looking back on the incident at the Grand Regency, Marcus understood that it had been both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge to remain composed in the face of injustice and an opportunity to catalyze meaningful change. Though he wouldn't wish such an experience on anyone, he recognized its value in shaping his perspective, and hopefully the perspectives of countless others. As he sat in his office one evening, gazing out at the city skyline, Marcus reminded himself of a simple truth. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to a larger wave of transformation. And sometimes standing up for yourself isn't just about claiming your own dignity, it's about inspiring others to claim theirs too.